Hi, welcome back to McNally's Musket Missive. I'm Harry McNally, and these are rifle muskets. Last episode we talked about the Model 1855, America's first rifle musket. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Model 1861, which for all intents and purposes is really the Model 1855 Type 6. The key differences between this and the previous model is the deletion of the maynard tape primer system, but you can still see the vestiges of the system in this model. The high hammer with clearance for the door, that compromised bolster system I talked about last time, where it goes down and then turns 90 degrees into the flash channel, the clean-out screw, that's all still there. So why, if they were going to go to the trouble of deleting the expensive maynard tape primer system, wouldn't they redesign the musket to be completely without it? Well, there's one big factor that caused that. When they decided to make the changes at the beginning of 1861, there was a small national emergency on the horizon. Shortly before production of the new Model 1861 began, the American Sengoku period began. The outbreak of the war forced them to abandon some of the changes they planned to make for the new model, mostly getting rid of the compromises that they had to do for the 1855's maynard tape primer system. This high hump on the hammer with the clearance for the door, that could have gone. The clean-out screw, we don't need that. The bolster could have been brought further into the barrel, eliminating some of the ignition problems we've been having. That 90-degree bend in the flash channel I talked about, that's completely unnecessary now that we've gotten rid of the maynard tape primer system. Those changes just would have taken too much time to implement, and they needed muskets in a hurry because they're fighting a war. The changes that were made were relatively minor. The tip of the ramrod was made slightly smaller because they were having problems with it getting stuck in the barrel after prolonged firing, causing fouling in the barrel. Another change was to the rear sight. A new rear sight with leaves protecting the sight leaves was developed, in part with the assistance of Sam Colt, who had a contract to produce muskets at the outbreak of the war. I'll go more into that next time. This 1861 dated Model 1861 doesn't have that because, as we've talked about previously, they had enough of the old parts on hand to keep using those until supplies were exhausted. Of the two national armories, only Springfield ever made the Model 1861. Early on in the war, Harper's Ferry was seized by the Confederates, and its machinery was sent down to Richmond, where the Confederates used it to make their own muskets. The so-called Richmond rifle is notable because it is even more of a modified 1855 than the 1861 is. You'll see on the lock of the 1861, it's been streamlined. The Richmond rifles have a high hump where the maynard mechanism would have been. They did their best to lower that as much as possible, but they didn't want to change the tooling too much because they needed muskets quickly and in a hurry. So as a result, you'll see a lot of 1855-derived Confederate muskets out there as well, and they fetch a pretty high penny these days. However, the Model 1861 was not made only by Springfield. During the war, it was produced by 19 different contractors. Springfield produced it from 1861 to 1863, with the contractors producing theirs until the end of the war. All told, Springfield made in their 2 years of production about 500,000 of them, and the contractors made just over 200,000, and they served until the end of the war. There's not a whole lot of difference between these two. Any government-accepted contractor musket would have interchanged completely with ones made at Springfield. But I'm going to just get them both over into the light box and talk about them a bit. So, as usual, we're starting with overviews of the rifles, starting with the Springfield, and now the Trenton, other side of the Springfield, and other side of the Trenton. You'll note these are pretty much almost identical to the 1855, as I said, minus the maynard tape primer systems. Looking at the lock and the rear sight of the Springfield, you'll note that it's a late-style 1855 rear sight without the protective ears on the covering the sight leaves. You'll also notice that this has clearly been cleaned up. The markings are kind of faded, and it's back down to bright metal. 1861 dated Springfields are uncommon enough that this was still worth picking up. So moving along to the Trenton, you'll notice that the rear sight's got ears covering the the sight leaves, giving it some protection. You'll note this one's a little rough, but it's still a good representative example of a contract-produced Springfield. Now, moving forward, the Springfield's rear barrel band and barrel band spring, same as in 1855, with the U telling the soldier which way goes which. Here's the Trenton. You'll note that the barrel band spring has its original blue finish. That's always nice to have. Middle band spring with the middle band and the rear and the sling swivel. Same deal on the Trenton, once again with the blue finish on the band spring. And the front band spring and business end of the Springfield, that pitting underneath the front sight suggests to me that this thing lived with a bayonet fixed to it for quite some time. That's just a guess, though. Same deal with the Trenton, just zoomed in for some reason. This guy lived a little bit of a rougher life with all that pitting. Flipping it over, we've got the lock panel of the Springfield. You'll note, if you look carefully, that the markings on the barrel are worn away, probably from when it was cleaned up. There are no cartouches remaining on the stock. Now on the Trenton, you'll see that there is a faint cartouche remaining. God only knows what it said. And note the NJ. That's a surcharge for New Jersey. This weapon belonged to the state of New Jersey. That thing I said during the video about how I could probably interchange these parts may not be entirely accurate, because my understanding is that a lot of the weapons that New Jersey purchased were ones that were rejected by federal inspectors. They got like second-class weapons for their use. Going back to the top at the tang of the Springfield, you notice that the barrel date is gone. There is a lot of pitting up there, which is indicative of heavy use, so this very well could be an 1861 dated barrel, but there's really no way of knowing because the markings are eradicated. Same deal with the Trenton. You'll notice the date of 1863 does not match the lock date of 1864, and that's quite common. You'll have parts from one production year being used at the beginning of the next production year, so the 63 dated barrel was parts on hand from when they had the 64 lock plate available. Springfield designed arms, such as the Model 1861 and the contract variants, were the most popular weapons in the American Civil War. I've heard at least one account of a Union regiment that was raised to fight under the promise of receiving Springfield-made arms, refusing to serve because they received what they considered to be inferior foreign arms. And there's a good reason for that, beyond just basic xenophobia. Springfield spent a lot of time, starting with almost 50 years, developing interchangeable parts. By the time of the Civil War, they were producing probably the most advanced arms in the world in terms of manufacturing. These were all interchangeable. I could take both of these muskets apart, tear them down, and build them up again using each other's parts. That's a big leap in manufacturing. The British didn't start doing that with their Enfields until 1861. They saw what we were doing over at Springfield, said, hey, that's a good idea, we should look into that, and began producing their Enfields with machine tooling around the time our Civil War began. None of those arms ever made it into the hands of U.S. or Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. All of those were made for the British government. The Enfields that did make it over, and I'll be going into that in detail in a later episode, were manufactured mostly by commercial builders in Birmingham and London, and they were still doing it by hand. There's a reason why these arms were prized by the soldiers. They were reliable, and if they broke, you could get them fixed. So that's everything I have for this episode. Please like this video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Comment below if you have anything you want to say. If you have any questions, by all means, I'd love to hear them and answer them. I would like to thank my Patreon sponsors for their generous support of my endeavors, and please consider becoming one of them. There's a link to my Patreon below in the description. But that's all I've got. Thanks for watching. Bye.